Officer Derek Malone's voice cut through the quiet cafe like a snapped command as he leaned over the small table and said, "People like you always act suspicious when someone is watching," while tapping the edge of Evan Carter's coffee cup with his gloved finger. The porcelain clink echoed too loudly in the nearly half-filled room, drawing a brief wave of shifting eyes from nearby customers who quickly returned to their phones or plates without speaking. Evan, dressed in a plain navy jacket and worn work boots, kept his gaze lowered for a fraction of a second, his fingers tightening around the edge of his ID wallet before he slowly placed it on the table without resistance. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face, subtle and contained, as if deciding whether to respond or absorb the moment in silence. Then he exhaled lightly through his nose and straightened his posture again. Malone smirked faintly, already comfortable in the space he occupied, and turned the ID slightly, as if it required interpretation. The cafe's background noise softened into an uneasy hum, the clatter of dishes and low conversation feeling distant as attention subtly centered around the table. Evan did not speak, but his stillness carried a controlled restraint that contrasted sharply with the officer's casual dominance. A barista paused mid-step behind the counter, watching for half a second too long before looking away. The air felt heavier without anyone naming it. Malone gestured slightly toward the entrance as if considering whether Evan should even remain seated, while Evan simply adjusted the cuff of his sleeve with measured calm, reclaiming his composure without confrontation. If you are watching this story, subscribe for more cinematic narratives like this and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next part. Also tell us where you are watching from and what time it is right now in your city. Evan Carter slowly slid the ID wallet back into his jacket pocket as Officer Derek Malone stepped half a pace to the side, already losing interest in the interaction as if it had only been a routine interruption in his morning. The cafe's ambient noise began to rebuild itself, chairs scraping lightly against tile floors and the soft hiss of the espresso machine returning to the background rhythm. Evan remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, eyes scanning the surface of the table where his coffee sat slightly displaced, a thin ring of liquid creeping toward the edge of the saucer. He reached forward and corrected it with a careful motion, but his hand paused for a fraction of a second midair, as if recalibrating focus before completing the gesture. Around him, the few customers who had looked earlier now avoided eye contact entirely, choosing instead to stare into phones or out the window where the Chicago morning traffic moved in muted gray layers. Malone spoke briefly into his radio without urgency, his tone flat, procedural, and already detached from Evan's presence, while one of the other officers leaned casually against the counter, scanning the room without interest. Evan adjusted the cuff of his sleeve again, a small repetitive motion that seemed less like habit and more like grounding, then reached for his coffee, but stopped just short of lifting it, his fingers hovering before settling back onto the table. A server nearby hesitated while wiping a neighboring table, glancing once toward the officers before continuing with slightly uneven strokes, the rhythm of the cloth dragging faintly across wood. Evan exhaled through his nose, subtle and controlled, then shifted his stance so that his weight distributed evenly between both feet, restoring a quiet composure that did not draw attention but did not disappear either. The light from the cafe window cut across his shoulder in a narrow band, highlighting dust particles suspended in the air that moved slowly with each passing breath of ventilation. Malone, now partially turned away, checked his phone with a faint impatience as if the situation had already resolved itself in his favor. Evan finally sat back down, not abruptly but with measured restraint, placing both hands on the table where they remained still, except for a brief tightening of his fingers that released moments later. The cafe returned to its surface-level normality, though nothing about the arrangement felt fully reset, only temporarily paused in a state of unresolved imbalance. Officer Derek Malone did not look back at Evan Carter as he stepped away from the table, but his presence remained in the cafe like a fixed point everyone unconsciously oriented around. Within seconds, the dynamic of the room subtly shifted as another officer approached the counter and spoke directly to the barista, who immediately straightened her posture and moved with slightly faster precision to prepare a fresh cup of coffee that was not for the general clientele, but for Malone himself. The gesture was quiet, almost invisible, yet it established a hierarchy that no one needed to explain. Evan remained seated, his hands still placed evenly on the table, but his eyes tracked these small adjustments. The way a nearby customer lowered their voice mid-sentence when Malone passed behind them. The way a chair was moved slightly to clear a path without being asked. The way the cafe staff recalibrated their attention without direct instruction. Evan reached for his coffee again, this time lifting it slightly before setting it back down with a slower motion than before, as if recalculating his presence within the space itself. His gaze drifted briefly toward the entrance where Malone now stood speaking with another officer, his posture relaxed, almost casual, as though the earlier interaction had never required effort. A delivery worker entered the cafe carrying a sealed bag, but paused instinctively at the sight of the uniforms and rerouted his path without being told, choosing a wider arc through the seating area. Evan adjusted his collar once, a small mechanical gesture, then reached into his pocket for a pen he did not immediately use, rolling it once between his fingers before returning it to the same place. The barista placed Malone's drink at the counter without announcing it, but the officer received it with a slight nod that acknowledged expectation rather than gratitude. Evan's attention lingered for a moment too long on that exchange, then shifted downward to the table where faint condensation rings from earlier cups had begun to dry unevenly under the cafe lights. He repositioned, his coffee cup a few inches to the left, aligning it with the edge of the table in a precise motion that seemed unnecessary but deliberate, then withdrew his hand quickly, as if correcting a habit. Malone's voice rose briefly in conversation with the other officer, not loud enough to dominate, but enough to subtly shape the room's silence, causing a nearby patron to pause mid-scroll on their phone before continuing more slowly. Evan remained composed, though his breathing changed slightly in rhythm, barely noticeable unless observed closely, and he glanced once toward the door as if measuring distance rather than escape. The cafe continued to function, but every movement inside it now carried a faint awareness of who was being watched and who was not. Evan Carter's fingers hovered over the edge of his coffee cup for a moment longer than necessary, then slowly shifted toward the napkin resting beside it, as if responding to a detail only he had noticed. A faint crease formed between his brows, subtle and brief, triggered by a sound from the counter where Officer Derek Malone was speaking more sharply now. His tone slightly tightened as he corrected the barista's pace. Evan's hand paused mid-motion, napkin half lifted. Then he set it down without using it, his attention momentarily fixed on a small paper receipt that had slid near the edge of the table. It was not his, but it had drifted into his space with the movement of air and passing trays. And for the first time since Malone had stepped into the cafe, Evan reached across the boundary of his own stillness to reposition something that did not belong to him. The movement was small, almost negligible, but deliberate enough to interrupt the established pattern of passivity. Malone noticed it almost immediately. His conversation slowed mid-sentence, his head turning slightly as his eyes tracked Evan's hand returning to rest on the table. The officer did not speak at first. Instead, he adjusted his stance, stepping half a pace closer as if recalibrating the space Evan occupied. The cafe barista hesitated behind the counter, a coffee cup suspended just above the saucer before she placed it down a fraction more carefully than before. Evan's posture remained composed, but his gaze did not return to neutral as quickly as it had earlier. He glanced once toward the receipt again, then to the table edge, then briefly toward Malone, as if confirming the boundaries had shifted in a way others might now recognize. Malone finally spoke, his voice even but noticeably firmer, no longer conversational but procedural, asking what Evan was doing with a tone that implied the question was unnecessary but required. Evan did not answer immediately. A short pause followed, during which his hand flexed once against the tabletop before relaxing again, a contained adjustment that suggested restraint rather than hesitation. When he finally responded, it was not with words directed at Malone, but with a simple act of sliding the receipt back toward the counter's general direction, aligning it with the flow of service rather than keeping it within his immediate space. The gesture caused a brief silence in the cafe that was not loud but noticeable, as if the room had recalculated its expectations. Malone's jaw tightened slightly, a barely visible shift, and he turned his body more fully toward Evan now, the earlier casual distance replaced with focused attention. The cafe door chimed again, but this time no one looked toward it, as Officer Derek Malone had fully occupied the center of the room without moving an inch, his presence now functioning like a boundary line everyone unconsciously respected. Evan Carter remained seated, but the space around him felt compressed, as if the table itself had become smaller under shifting attention. Malone did not raise his voice. Instead, he lowered it slightly, forcing others to lean in or miss details, a quiet method of control that made even background noise feel like interference. He asked for Evan's identification again, slower this time, not because he needed it, but because repetition had become a form of dominance. Evan reached into his jacket, but his movement was no longer smooth. His fingers paused halfway inside the pocket, holding there for a fraction too long before retrieving the wallet. The hesitation was subtle but visible to anyone paying attention. A chair scraped faintly near the window as a customer adjusted their position, then stopped entirely when Malone glanced in that direction. Evan placed the wallet on the table, but instead of opening it immediately, his hand stayed resting on top of it, as if waiting for something external to determine the next step. Malone did not take it right away. He stood still, letting the delay stretch, then finally extended his hand and tapped the wallet once, not to open it, but to signal expectation. Evan's jaw tightened briefly, a small shift that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He opened the wallet with slower precision than before, his fingers slightly less steady, exposing the ID without lifting it fully off the table, as if minimizing exposure could reduce consequence. The cafe's barista slowed her movements behind the counter, pretending to organize cups that were already aligned, while a customer near the wall lowered their phone without unlocking it again. Malone studied the ID longer than necessary, then angled it slightly toward the light as though verifying something beyond its printed details. He asked Evan to state his full name aloud, not for clarity but for record presence. Evan complied, but his voice came out marginally delayed, a fraction behind expectation, forcing a brief recalibration in the room's rhythm. Malone's expression tightened subtly at that delay, not enough to be overt irritation, but enough to signal dissatisfaction with anything that did not align with his internal pacing. He closed the wallet himself before Evan could, placing it back on the table with controlled force that made the edge of the coffee cup tremble slightly. Evan reached for it instinctively, then stopped mid-motion when Malone did not step back. Instead, the officer leaned closer, resting one hand on the chair opposite Evan without sitting, occupying the space without sharing it. The cafe air shifted again, quieter now, as even small movements from other patrons diminished. Evan adjusted his posture upright, but the adjustment was slightly late, as if he had to remind himself of how to sit within his own body under observation. A faint sound from the kitchen dropped a plate onto a metal tray, sharper than intended, causing a brief flicker of attention across multiple heads before settling back into controlled stillness. Malone finally exhaled through his nose, a restrained sound that signaled continued authority without escalation. Evan's fingers curled once against the edge of the table, then released, a contained reset of composure that did not fully erase the disruption in his rhythm. The tension remained suspended, unresolved, tightening not through action, but through sustained imbalance that neither side acknowledged directly. The cafe settled into a subdued rhythm after Malone stopped speaking, not because anything had resolved, but because the absence of immediate escalation forced the room into a fragile stillness. Evan Carter remained seated with his hands now placed symmetrically on the table, palms down, fingers slightly spread, as if stabilizing himself through contact rather than motion. His gaze stayed forward for a few seconds longer than necessary before drifting downward to the faint reflection of overhead lights on the coffee surface, which had begun to cool into a darker, heavier tone. A slight adjustment in his breathing followed, not deep enough to be noticeable at first glance, but paced in a way that suggested conscious regulation rather than relaxation. Officer Malone, still standing near the opposite chair, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes no longer scanning the room, but now resting intermittently on Evan's hands, then his face, then the surrounding space, as if recalibrating a variable he had not fully accounted for. The cafe barista resumed wiping the counter, but with slower, more segmented strokes, pausing briefly between each pass of the cloth, as though the earlier pressure had left an invisible constraint on timing itself. Evan reached for his coffee again, but this time his hand stopped halfway, hovering above the cup for a second longer than before, then changing direction to adjust the position of the cup instead of lifting it. The movement was subtle, but the correction felt intentional, as if prioritizing order over consumption. A customer near the window shifted slightly in their seat, the sound of fabric against wood barely audible, but enough to draw a brief flicker of Evan's eyes toward the source before he returned to neutral focus. Malone exhaled slowly through his nose, then looked toward the entrance without moving his head fully, maintaining a posture that kept Evan within peripheral control. The officer's radio remained clipped to his shoulder, silent but present, its weight implied in the slight tilt of his uniform. Evan's fingers tapped once against the table, not rhythmically, but as a single corrective gesture, then stopped entirely as if he had interrupted his own impulse mid-cycle. The cafe lighting remained unchanged, but the perception of space felt narrower, with the distance between table, counter, and entrance appearing more compressed due to the sustained attention centered on Evan. A faint sound from outside the door, indistinct and unimportant, caused no visible reaction from Malone, but Evan's eyes tracked it for a fraction longer than expected before returning forward. The barista placed a napkin stack slightly off alignment, then corrected it immediately, her movements careful and measured, as if overcompensating for earlier hesitation. Evan adjusted his posture again, this time leaning back a few inches before settling forward into a neutral position, a sequence that suggested recalibration rather than comfort. Malone finally shifted his stance away from the chair, not stepping closer or further, but rotating slightly to re-establish a dominant angle of observation. The cafe remained quiet in a way that felt maintained rather than natural, with every action now occurring under implicit awareness of visibility and consequence, while no resolution emerged to relieve the sustained imbalance. The cafe's stillness broke first not with movement inside, but with the faint vibration of a phone on the counter behind Officer Derek Malone, a device he had not been using a moment earlier. It buzzed once, then again, sharper this time, causing his attention to shift briefly away from Evan Carter for the first time in several minutes. Malone reached back, picked up the phone, and glanced at the screen with casual expectation that immediately changed when his thumb paused mid-scroll. The shift was subtle but immediate, his posture tightening by a fraction as his eyes reread the same line twice. Evan remained seated, hands still placed evenly on the table, not reacting to the phone, maintaining the same controlled stillness he had held throughout the exchange, but his gaze lifted slightly, tracking Malone's microchange rather than the device itself. The barista behind the counter stopped mid-motion again, sensing without understanding that something in the room had recalibrated. Malone turned the phone slightly toward better light, his jaw setting in a way that did not belong to routine procedure. He stepped one pace away from Evan's table, creating distance for the first time, and spoke quietly into the phone with a tone that lost its earlier ease, replaced by a more measured precision. The cafe's ambient sound did not change, but its perceived weight did, as if the background noise had been muted around a central point of focus. Evan's fingers shifted once against the table edge, not retreating, not advancing, but stabilizing, a small adjustment that aligned with a decision not yet visible but already forming in the room. Malone listened longer than expected, then said nothing for a brief interval that felt noticeably out of sync with his earlier control. A second officer, previously leaning near the counter, now straightened fully and looked directly toward Malone, waiting for instruction that did not come immediately. The delay itself became the signal. Evan's eyes moved briefly toward the entrance again, and this time the door opened without hesitation. Two federal agents stepped inside, their presence not loud but structurally definitive, scanning the room once and locking onto Malone before acknowledging anyone else. One of them spoke Evan's full name without checking identification, and the cafe reacted instantly. The barista froze mid-reach, a seated customer lowered their phone completely, and Malone's posture shifted in a way that was no longer observational but reactive. Evan did not move at first, maintaining the same seated position, but His hands subtly lifted from the table and rested together, no longer spread, a controlled consolidation rather than withdrawal. Malone attempted to speak, but the first word did not fully land before the federal agent raised a hand, interrupting not through force, but through procedural authority that required no volume. The agent confirmed Evan's identity aloud as Division Chief Evan Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Midwest Intelligence Unit, a statement that did not echo but instead settled heavily into the room like a fixed fact. Malone did not respond immediately. His eyes flicked once to Evan, then to the agent, then to the phone in his hand, as if recalculating the validity of everything prior. The second officer stepped half a pace backward without instruction, creating physical separation from Malone for the first time. Evan finally stood, not abruptly but with controlled timing, and the movement alone redefined the spatial hierarchy of the cafe more effectively than any spoken correction. Malone remained in place, but his stance no longer anchored the room, and the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It had shifted ownership without needing explanation. The cafe did not return to normal after Evan Carter stood. It simply reorganized itself around a new center of gravity that no longer belonged to Officer Derek Malone. The federal agents remained near the entrance, one position slightly ahead of the other, both scanning without urgency, but with absolute structural awareness, while Malone stood near the middle of the room for the first time without a defined role. His hand still held his phone, but the screen had gone dark without him noticing, his thumb hovering above it once before dropping away entirely. The motion was small, but it marked the first visible break in his earlier rhythm of control. Evan remained standing, not advancing toward anyone, not retreating either, his posture steady and unchanged, as if the shift in authority had not altered his internal calibration. One of the agents spoke briefly into a secure device, not loudly, but the sound carried enough to cause a subtle ripple of stillness through the cafe staff. The barista stopped wiping the counter completely, cloth suspended in her hand, eyes fixed on the federal insignia, now fully visible on the agent's jacket. Malone finally attempted to move, taking a half step toward Evan as if to re-establish conversational proximity, but he stopped mid-motion when the second agent shifted slightly to block a direct line of approach without touching him or speaking. The interruption was not forceful, yet it removed any ambiguity about directional control in the room. Malone adjusted his stance immediately, redirecting his weight backward rather than forward, a correction that looked almost automatic but carried visible hesitation. He cleared his throat once, a reflex that did not lead into speech, and instead looked briefly toward Evan as if reassessing the sequence of events that had just dissolved his earlier assumptions. Evan did not acknowledge the look. Instead, he reached down and picked up his coffee cup for the first time in several minutes, not drinking from it, but simply holding it at mid-level before placing it back down with careful precision, a motion that now felt uninterrupted rather than constrained. The cafe customers, who had previously been avoiding direct attention, now observed in fragments. A glance from behind a menu, a partial turn of a head before correction, the kind of awareness that emerged only when uncertainty replaced assumed hierarchy. Malone spoke finally, but his voice lacked the earlier procedural cadence. It was shorter, more segmented, as if each word required internal verification before release. He addressed the federal agent rather than Evan, asking for clarification in a tone that attempted neutrality but carried the weight of recalibrated position. The agent responded without elaboration, confirming only what was necessary and withholding anything beyond formal acknowledgement. Malone nodded once, but the gesture did not complete its usual cycle of authority affirmation. It ended too early, slightly incomplete. He shifted his eyes back to Evan, then away again almost immediately, as if the direct line of assessment now carried unintended consequence. Evan remained unchanged in posture and expression, his stillness now functioning differently in the room, no longer read as compliance, but as established reference point. One of the cafe chairs was nudged slightly by a passing agent repositioning himself, and the sound of its legs against tile caused Malone to glance downward briefly, breaking eye contact entirely. The barista resumed movement, but only in minimal increments, her actions slower than necessary, as if the environment itself required caution before resuming routine function. Malone attempted one more step toward the counter, then stopped mid-transition when the second agent adjusted position again, not obstructing but rendering the movement unnecessary. He exhaled through his nose, then remained where he was, hands now lowered and no longer actively engaged with any object. The room held its new structure without announcement, and the earlier dominance he had maintained dissolved into a state of monitored neutrality that required no further confirmation. Officer Derek Malone finally moved, but not in the way he had moved throughout the entire encounter. There was no attempt to regain proximity, no effort to reassert presence. Instead, he stepped back toward the edge of the cafe floor where the counter met the wall, his posture no longer occupying space, but yielding it in controlled increments. The federal agents did not speak, yet their positioning remained unchanged, confirming that nothing required further negotiation. Malone reached into his pocket and retrieved his badge, holding it for a brief moment at chest level before lowering it again without presentation, as if the act itself had lost procedural relevance. He turned slightly toward Evan Carter, paused, then redirected his gaze downward instead of meeting his eyes. That single break in visual alignment marked the final collapse of his earlier certainty. Evan did not move or react. He simply remained standing in the same position he had held since the agents entered, hands relaxed at his sides, expression unchanged, his presence now functioning as the fixed reference point of the room. One of the cafe customers stood slowly, then hesitated before sitting back down, as if unsure whether departure or stillness was appropriate in a space that had lost its previous hierarchy. The barista set down the cloth she had been holding and stepped fully behind the counter, no longer attempting to clean or reset anything, her attention now fixed on waiting for instructions that would not come from Malone. The second officer near the counter lowered his stance slightly, not in subordination but in procedural completion, signaling disengagement from escalation. Malone exhaled once, deeper than before, and then reached for his radio, but instead of speaking into it, he simply unclipped it and held it at his side. After a brief pause, he placed it back on his shoulder without transmitting anything, a motion that felt final rather than reconsidered. The cafe lighting remained steady, but the perception of space had fully stabilized around Evan and the federal agents, with Malone occupying no directional influence over movement or attention. Evan finally shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, a minimal adjustment that now went unnoticed as disruption and instead registered as normal presence. The lead federal agent gave a small, single nod, not directed at Malone, but at confirmation of internal procedure completion, then turned slightly toward Evan, as if concluding an operational check. Malone took one last step backward, aligning himself with the cafe wall, no longer attempting to occupy central space or interaction lines. His hands remained visible but inactive, and his posture settled into stillness that no longer suggested authority but containment. The room did not return to its previous state. Instead, it remained permanently recalibrated, with Evan standing as the unchallenged reference point of all remaining movement. As the agents prepared to exit with him, Evan adjusted his jacket once, then followed without urgency, leaving behind a table where his untouched coffee slowly cooled beside a folded napkin, while the cafe continued its quiet operations around the fact that nothing would return to what it had been before. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts, subscribe for more cinematic stories, and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.